Book of Revelation, as I say, a lot of people are very wary of it. One famous writer and theologian, most modern readers find it baffling and impenetrable. Moreover, they are often not sure it's worth attempting to understand, since they most readily associate it with eccentric and even dangerous sects. So I don't know if that's your experience of it, that it's actually difficult to understand, and actually it's probably easier to just not read it than it is to worry about what it says. But he goes on to make the point, yet this book that has inspired them, this is a book that has inspired the martyrs, nourished the imagination of visionaries, artists and hymn writers, resourced prophetic cliques of oppression and corruption in state and church, and sustained hope and resistance in the most hopeless situations. So I guess the part of the reason that Revelation has fallen off the radar for much of the church in the UK probably is life is pretty comfortable most of the time. Whereas if you travel to persecuted parts of the world where Christians are being imprisoned, Revelation is their go-to book. It's something that they draw great comfort from reading. And over history, it's been a key part. One author reckons that the book of Revelation has inspired more Christian art than any other part of the Bible. I'm not saying it's inspired good Christian art, it's just inspired Christian art. There's some crazy stuff out there. You can imagine some of the vivid imagery that Revelation contains does lend itself to artistic impression, shall we say. So, this book that is so vital and important to understand to churches that are experiencing oppression. For instance, when I was living in Romania, the Romanian church loved Revelation because of their experiences under Ceausescu, and they drew great comfort from it during that period. So, we are going to take a little look at some of the background to it. So the first thing to say is who wrote it? Well, we know it was a guy called John. There's a bit of debate about which John, but a lot of scholars would say, to be honest, he obviously had a lot of authority, and the early church clearly took him seriously, which would imply he was a John with a great deal of authority, i.e. an apostle. But also we have from the 2nd century, a guy called Irenaeus, who was a disciple of a guy called Polycarp, and Polycarp knew John. He was friends with John. So actually, Irenaeus says John wrote Revelation. So we would take that from church history, that actually he got that from his teacher, Polycarp, who knew the guy. So I think that's a reasonable conclusion to draw, that actually it was John the Apostle. Once again, as we saw with the letters, the dating of Revelation is a matter of a great deal of controversy amongst writers, but recent scholarship seems to be coming down on the side of the idea it happened around AD 90, 95, the late 1st century, basically. The key thing is we think it was after the destruction of the temple by the Romans, as we saw in week 1, because they equate, there's a way of reading Revelation that when you see Babylon, you can read it as Rome, because Rome, like Babylon, destroyed the temple. So there's that idea that actually there's this symbol, that Rome and Babylon reflect each other in the way that they both treated Israel and the fact that they destroyed the temple. So the idea that there's this kind of Roman understanding of who Babylon is in Revelation makes us think it was later. The other reason we think it was later is because the persecution was kind of local rather than across the region. So as we'll see, that is relevant to Revelation. And we think that John wrote it, we know he wrote it on the island of Patmos, which if I had a map, it's right over by Turkey. It's one of the Greek islands really close to Turkey. And he was in exile. He'd been imprisoned for spreading the gospel. And once again, this speaks to the idea that he was a senior member of the early church, because the Romans wouldn't have bothered with just a run-of-the-mill Christian. But if he was a key leader causing trouble, then they would very well have arrested him and put him into exile. So, island of Patmos. So, why do we think he wrote to the early church? Well, we think that the catalyst for this was the Imperial cult in Ephesus. So basically what we have here on the left is a picture of a temple to, now I can't remember whether it's Domitian or Domitian, but whichever it is, that emperor, there was a temple dedicated to him. And on the right, you can see a rather hideous but massive statue that was part of the temple in Ephesus. I included the picture of the woman walking off to give you an idea of the scale. It's an absolutely colossal statue. And so what happened in the Roman world was they would venerate their emperors and deify them. They would make them gods. And you would then be forced to worship them. And so what we think happened was, in the far-flung reaches of the empire over in Asia Minor, that local officials, in an attempt to curry favor with Rome, went big on worshipping the emperor. So you can imagine building a temple, grand statues dedicated to the emperor would win you, as a local provincial governor, a fair bit of goodwill back in Rome. So the idea is that actually these regional outposts could sometimes be far stricter about emperor worship than perhaps would even have happened in Rome itself. The other issue is the Christians by this time had been recognized as being not Jewish, so that meant they lost all imperial protection that the Jews enjoyed. So they were just a cult and they could be treated however you liked. So there's a theory that actually this explosion in emperor worship in Asia Minor around Ephesus was the reason that John felt the need to write to these early believers, because the Jewish converts were beginning to think of turning back to Judaism and back into the protection of the synagogue, and the Gentile converts were being encouraged to compromise. And what would happen is there would be processions through the city, and everybody, as you went past, would be encouraged to make an offering or say a prayer or something towards the emperor. And the early Christians, of course, didn't want to do that. And so they were under huge pressure. So there's an idea that actually these first Gentile believers in Ephesus and Philadelphia and Smyrna were beginning to compromise and potentially give in to the imperial cult. So John writes to encourage them to stick at it, to keep going. And the way that he does this is with a particular type of writing called apocalyptic. Now, the Greek word apocalypse just means to reveal or uncover that which was hidden. So to draw back the curtains on the reality that is behind our physical world. So the idea that actually what he's doing is helping us see what's going on behind the scenes. So you can see apocalypse, to reveal, that's where we get the name Revelation, that actually it's revealing what's going on in the spiritual realm. So he's revealing what was hidden. And the idea here is to encourage these early believers. So the goal for Revelation is to bring encouragement to believers of all ages, that God is working out his purposes even in the midst of tragedy, suffering, and apparent satanic domination. It is the Bible's battle cry of victory, for in it, more than anywhere else in the New Testament, is revealed the final victory of God over all the forces of evil. So what you can see here is John's approach is to show people that actually colluding with the powers of this world, with Rome, will lead to destruction, that Rome's days are numbered, that actually Rome isn't going to be the top dog forever, and in fact colluding with human powers at all always ends in defeat, and that God is the one who will have the final say in the final victory. So don't go choosing the losing side. Stick with this God that will one day reveal what's actually the reality of his rule and reign and put Satan and all his forces in their place. So that you can see that that's the approach he's taking. Now, the only problem with that is the way Revelation has been used by the church. So I came across this quote, which I liked. It said, primarily, the book purposes to encourage Christians undergoing persecution, not to confuse or divide its readers over fine points of eschatology. And the reality is, Revelation has become a way of persecuting Christians again, but this time by Christians. So Christians arguing with other Christians over what the meaning of the book of Revelation is. And people can get very, very het up about this. Very het up. So just to warn that the reality is this book is there to encourage us, not to cause arguments and dissent. So, how do we read it well? Well, I've mentioned before, the first thing to do is to pray. So let me pray for us as we kind of dive in. Father God, I pray now for us as we continue to discuss this book, that you would open our eyes, that you would help us to grow in confidence when reading it, that we would see what its purpose is and how best to approach it. But Lord, most of all, we pray that as we read it, we would be encouraged, that our faith would grow, that our trust in you and our hope in our future would grow as well. In Jesus' name, amen. Great stuff. So every week I say the same thing, which is one of the keys to understanding any book of the Bible is the Old Testament. Now, when it comes to Revelation, this is especially true. To give you a point, so first off, John identifies himself as a prophet in the line of the Old Testament prophets, speaking the word of the Lord in both judgment and promise. So it's important when reading Revelation to have in mind the earlier prophets. And as we'll see, those prophets use themes and ideas that John then builds on in Revelation, as well as adding some of his own stuff. Did you realize that 278 out of 404 verses in Revelation contain references to the Old Testament? So over half, almost 3/4 of the book of Revelation is packed with Old Testament references. There are over 500 allusions to Old Testament texts, like where he says, one like a son of man in chapter 1, verse 13, which is referencing Daniel. Over 500 times, John uses imagery, ideas, references from the Old Testament to make his points. So once again, it's so important that we understand the Old Testament in order to get the most out of this amazing book. You'll notice as you even start reading it in the first few verses of Revelation, there are 7 allusions to the Old Testament. It's just so densely packed. And so one writer argues that Revelation has more allusions to the Old Testament than the rest of the New Testament put together. So actually, if there ever was a book that was an argument for reading the Old Testament, it's Revelation. That if you want to get the most out of Revelation, you really need to put in the time and read the Old Testament. So what kind of book is it? Well, we say that when we're reading the New Testament, it's really important to know what genre you're reading. And so the thing to understand here is Revelation is 3 genres in one. It's a bargain, 3 for the price of 1. You get a letter, you get prophecy, and you get something called the Apocalyptic. Now, the Apocalyptic was a genre of writing that would have been very familiar to the first century readers, that actually there were various other apocalyptic writings out there, and they would major on imagery and the kind of heavenly realms, and of course the end times. But the reality is we can overstate the case. Sometimes we go too far and say, oh, Revelation's a special case, it's its own thing, and then we discount the techniques we would use in reading other parts of the Bible. But the reality is you need to read it as a letter, you need to have all of your learning about how to read prophecy well, and then you do have to factor in these kind of some of the themes of the apocalyptic, which we'll look at in a little bit later. So my argument would be that the best way to approach it is as a prophetic apocalyptic letter. So it is a letter. It is written to a group of churches for a purpose, as we've seen. It's written to these 7 churches that we read about in the book of Revelation. So the idea is that John wrote it from Patmos as a circular letter. It would have traveled probably first to Ephesus by boat, and then it would have done the circuit. Now, if you read the letter to the 7 churches at the beginning of Revelation, you'll see that the response that the churches would have had to it varied depending on what he had to say to them. So some of them get commended, some of them get, well, properly told off. So you can imagine the reception the guy carrying the letter would have varied dramatically from place to place to place. But we do need to bear in mind that earlier context of Rome and Domitian, because these are letters written to encourage a group of believers experiencing persecution in a particular political, social context. So we just need to have that in mind as we read it. Because some of the stuff in Revelation is imagery deliberately chosen to have a go at the emperor and Rome. They actually contain some symbols that the people reading it at the time would have immediately gone, hang on a second, that's just like what the emperor does, or that's like the emperor's throne, and immediately they would have seen the critique of the powers of the human powers they were surrounded by. So it's a letter to a particular group of churches. It contains a whole heap of prophecy and the apocalyptic. So just to give you an example of how Revelation functions in the line of Old Testament prophecy, I've got 3 readings here, and you'll notice that all of them depict the heavenly throne room. and they all are full of imagery and kind of glory and fire and figures and all this incredible stuff. But the reality is the first one's from Ezekiel, the second one's from Daniel, and the third one's from Revelation. So you can see, you could read the first one and it reads very much like something you would expect to find in Revelation. You can read Daniel and you'll actually see there a whole load of imagery that you would expect to see in Revelation. And some writers go even further to say that Daniel is really the key Old Testament book for understanding the book of Revelation. That the better we understand Daniel, the better we'll understand the book of Revelation. But the point I want to make is, it is prophecy in the sense Old Testament was prophecy, but it's also apocalyptic. And so the idea here is the way that something becomes intensified. So you have two pictures there of the Hulk. One was of a normal human being who just did a lot of weights. The other is what you do when you do CGI Hulk. And you can see how much more extreme and overemphasized the second image is. Well, in some ways, that's how the apocalyptic functions. It's an overemphasis of themes that you find in the prophetic. So in the prophecies in the Old Testament, in Ezekiel, in Hosea, in Daniel, you'll have throne rooms, you'll have angels, you'll have the glory of God, you'll have the heavenly realm, you'll have the heavenly temple. But in Revelation, it's to the power of 10. It's emphasized, it's more dramatic, it's even greater. So that's where I think it's important to remember that the apocalypse is an intensification of end time prophecy that you read in the Old Testament. And I think that's a really helpful way to read it, rather than being frightened off that it's its own thing that's totally unrelated to anything else. So it's an intensification. So, any questions so far before we have a look at some of the key features of Revelation?
Dave, presumably it's written in imagery, because if you made it too directly referring to the emperor, that was your last lot.
Yeah, and so we're going to look at that in a minute. The way that Revelation often functions in the same way a parable does. And Jesus would use parables to hide in some ways, his outright outrageous claims from the authorities of the time. So yes, that definitely, John is very smart in his use of the apocalyptic literature type to hide messages directly to the church of the time about the persecution they were experiencing. It's a very clever delivery system, a coded delivery system, if you like, to encourage the early church. Any other questions or comments?
Tim, Dave, I don't really understand the last few books of Daniel, I think is the problem. Yeah.
So I think what we'll do is, as we go through, hopefully it will help us see a little bit of what Daniel's getting at as well, because I think they are related. Any other questions or comments? Right, well, we'll press on. So, the key features of Revelation. Well, the first is, as I've said, as an intensification of prophecy, we always need to remember that prophecy has two goals. One is forthtelling, telling forth, as in speaking into the current context, as well as foretelling and pointing forwards to a later time. Because that's the danger, is if you just read Revelation as being about the end of days, you miss a lot of stuff. And in some ways, you have to realize that as a pastoral letter to those early churches experiencing persecution, John wanted to tell them some stuff about their life now, about what was going on around them now, not just wait, guys, bad luck, the persecution's here, you're probably all going to be killed, but it's fine because one day everything's going to be okay. It's not the most encouraging of approaches. I think there's something in what John does in Revelation that would have been encouraging to them in that moment, as well as about their future hope. So forthtelling as well as foretelling. The other key feature of the apocalyptic, and often of the prophetic, is it draws back the curtain on the heavenly perspective. So what, as I mentioned, is the idea here is it's saying to the early church and to us, there are realities beyond what you can see and touch. And actually those realities affect what we're doing now, but also that heavenly perspective that actually God is going to win, that the victory Jesus won on the cross will one day be fully realized. So guys, don't give in now. So the analogy I often use is of D-Day. So the whole point with the Second World War was effectively from the moment the Allied forces landed in such vast numbers in northern France, you could be fairly confident they would go on to win the war. But the war wasn't finally won until 1945. So there's this idea that actually the cross in some ways represents D-Day and 1945 represents the end of Revelation. And so the challenge is to live in between those two times and not to give up when the struggle after D-Day, those hard fought battles to eventually get to Berlin, to stretch an analogy to complete breaking point, he's trying to say to them, guys, don't give up, keep going, we are going to win, it is going to be, God is victorious, don't throw in the towel, even though, a bit like the Battle of the Bulge, at times it can look like you're losing. But the reality is the end is fixed, the end is sure and safe. As I've mentioned, this drawing back the curtain on the physical world to see the spiritual dimension as well, he does talk a lot about how the spiritual realities have an impact and that there are spiritual realities. And in some ways, I think that's important for us to remember that actually there is something going on behind what we can see. And I think as believers, sometimes we forget that. We make it very much about the physical struggle. But certainly John in Revelation is keen to encourage us to engage with spiritual realities. And finally, one of the key features of Revelation, and probably what causes the most trouble, is the symbolism. It is packed full of images, symbols, all kinds of stuff. And so how do we read those well and what do they mean? So we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. And the key to understanding it is our friend Daniel. Because Daniel, having his visions that then he is able to explain, gives us an insight into how visions function. And so in chapter 2, you'll see Daniel faces this uphill task. Do you remember I think it's Nebuchadnezzar cheats. And he says, I've had a dream, but I'm not going to tell any of you what the dream is. And you need to work out what the dream is and then tell me the interpretation. So Daniel prays, and this is what he says before he reveals what the vision actually meant. And he says, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you were lying in bed are these. And then he goes on to say, as your majesty was lying there, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. So this is Daniel's prologue to the interpretation. This is Daniel explaining to the king how visions from God work. And it has these 4 elements that you'll see are highlighted in red. And they are, there's a revelation that God has showed concerning what will come to pass, and he has signified it or shown it. And the reason that sounds a little bit odd is because the Greek word is often translated showed, but can also mean signified. So in other words, there has been a revelation. You've had a revelation, something has been revealed from God. God's the one who showed you this concerning what will come to pass. And he has done it through a symbol or through symbols or through your vision, through images. So that's Daniel chapter 2. We then turn to Revelation chapter 1, and John's prologue to Revelation starts, the revelation from Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John. And we have the same 4 elements at the beginning of Revelation, that there is a revelation that God has shown concerning what will come to pass, and he signified it. He demonstrated it with these symbols and images and visions that you have had. Now, here's the thing. No one in their right mind, or in the book of Daniel, do we have the statue that the king sees is never built. It's not a literal prediction. When the king has the vision and it's going to be something that will come to pass, the vision of the statue is not then built. What happens is the different elements of the statue represent the rise and fall of empires and ultimately demonstrate that God is God over all, and even these empires are nothing compared to him, and he is the one who will reign eternally. So then to read Revelation and say these events involving these fantastical creatures or some of these amazing visions must be literally true, fundamentally misunderstands how visions function in the Old Testament. Does that make sense? So I would say there's quite a compelling case for reading Revelation as symbolic, that actually where we see these fantastical images, these incredible creatures, John is saying they are symbols of another reality. We are not necessarily to expect 5-headed monsters or dragons in the future. John is saying these things represent another reality, and our job is to try and work out what reality he's actually saying these symbols are pointing us to or showing us. And so one author would go even further to say, unless there is strong evidence in the text to the contrary, the visions are for the most part to be taken non-literally. This doesn't mean they have no meaning or historical reference, but that the meaning is to be found symbolically and almost always within the context of Old Testament references which run through the visions God gave to John. And so scholars are doing more and more work on Revelation through the lens of the Old Testament. So whenever they come across an image or a symbol, they go back through the Old Testament looking for where those images and symbols were used and what they signified, because that is probably what John is intending when he uses those images in his writing. And so when we're reading Revelation, where John explains the symbol, we need to use his interpretation. So there are a few places where he outright explains it to us. So the classic would be in Revelation 1:20, he actually says these lampstands represent the 7 churches. And even with that, so just to give a little example, you see lampstands to a first century audience, they then think the temple. The temple had 7 lampstands. So what's he saying here? He's saying that the churches represent the new temple. They are the new inhabitation of God's Spirit, which we see in 1 Peter, where God says, where Peter encourages the church by saying, you are the temple built with living stones. So the idea here is when you see churches, he says lampstands. When you see lampstands, you think and that's kind of how you read Revelation, is when we come across an image, does he explain it or not? If he doesn't, go back to the Old Testament and try and work out from the Old Testament referencing what he's picking on, what kind of image he's trying to convey. And as I say, if there's no direct interpretation, we need to look to the Old Testament and the context. So to give another example, the beast and the harlot in Revelation 17. Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by the many waters. With her kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. Now, John is not suggesting that at some point in the future, a prostitute riding on the back of some beastly dragon-like thing will descend on earth. But the imagery he's conveying here, when we go back to the Old Testament, what we find is a verse in Isaiah where it talks about a prostitute leading astray the people of God through economic power and immorality and idolatry. And that economic power is Tyre, the kingdom of Tyre. So Isaiah prophesies against Tyre using the imagery of a prostitute who leads people into unfaithfulness from God and who intoxicates them with the wine of her adulteries. And the idea of the intoxication in Isaiah is about the fact that they've been won over, they've been bribed by economic wealth and prosperity. So, is he referring to Tyre here? Well, no, he's using this prophecy, this image, to refer to Babylon. Now, Babylon, as we know, the question is he referring to an event that will happen in the future? As I say, is there going to be a dragon or an empire? Is he referring to the past? Those of you with particularly sharp eyes will see the person who painted this picture clearly had an opinion, because you'll see St. Peter's Basilica in the background. So quite clearly, as far as the person painting this was concerned, he's talking about Rome. So the question is this something that's going to happen in the future? Is it referring to Rome at that time? Or actually, is it a critique of all corrupt political and economic systems that lead the people of God astray and cause them to be unfaithful to God? And so the interesting thing here is Revelation working on several levels. And I think the levels it works on is an encouragement to the believers of the day that Rome is not to be trusted and Rome will get its comeuppance. But as we read it, we don't read it thinking that prophecy is only for the people back then. We also don't read it thinking one day there'll be a beast and a prostitute and we need to watch out for that. The way we should read it is to say the point of this is it's a condemnation of corrupt political and economic systems that lead the people of God astray. Does that make sense? So when we're reading this fantastical imagery, we sometimes need to go backwards so that we can come forwards. So in this case, going back to Tyre, seeing its application to Rome, and then working out what it means for us today in the 21st century. And I would argue this passage is as relevant to us today as it is to those early Christians being persecuted by Rome. That as believers in the 21st century, we're constantly being intoxicated by the wines of adultery, of capitalism, materialism, individualism, and a whole load of other isms. We're easily led astray. And so we need to be aware of that. So, now to the fun bit. Numbers in Revelation. John loves numbers. He goes a bit bonkers with numbers. So the numbers to watch out for are 4, 7, 10, and 12. Okay? And then unhelpfully, they're multiples as well, which might test your mathematical ability at times. When you're reading a number in Revelation, you're thinking, hang on a second, is that multiple? Is that a multiple of another number? Oh. So the key thing is, these numbers were all highly symbolic to the Jewish people. And so, generally, they all point to the same sort of idea. They all are linked to the idea of completeness or the universal nature of something. So, for example, the number 4. In Genesis 1, Genesis 1, I think it talks about the 4 rivers. And the idea there, that's the completeness of creation that you see worked out time and time again in the Old Testament by talking about the 4 corners of the earth or the 4 winds. It doesn't kind of imply there are winds that come from only 4 directions. Here, the idea is the totality of creation, the whole of the earth. So whenever you see a 4, it's this idea of the universal, the completeness of something. The same with 7. Obviously, 7 is based on the 7 days of creation, which completed the earth. It was God created it and it was good. So this idea that actually this is the totality of creation. So when in the Old Testament we see examples of the sevenfold anger of God, it doesn't mean he gets angry 7 times. It's basically saying that what on earth just happened? Can you still see it?
Oh, no.
Okay, my computer just crashed in a really weird way. So you can see the number 7? Give me a thumbs up. Yeah, thanks. So the sevenfold anger of God isn't suggesting that he got angry 7 times. The sevenfold anger of God is talking about God's complete anger. It is the universal nature of his wrath, the universal subjugation of his wrath. And then the 7 lamps in the tabernacle. Again, it's this idea of completeness, fullness, wholeness. 10s are a huge thing because of the 10 commandments. To the Jewish people, the 10 commandments were perfect. They were the ideal. And we'll see in Ezekiel in the Old Testament, the numbers 1,000, 10,000 in the measurements of the temple. Again, the idea that the temple wasn't 10,000 cubits long in reality, but that it was perfect in its dimensions. And then the 12s, obviously, we see the 12 tribes. Various bits of the Old Testament go absolutely crazy on this. So particular in 1 Chronicles when it talks about the priests and musicians that will serve. They're 24s, they're 288 of them. It literally multiples of 12 all over the place. So whenever you see a number, one of these numbers in Revelation, it's not actually saying that is the number of things that will occur. So the sevens in particular that we see throughout the main structure of Revelation, as we'll see, it's not saying there will be 7 seals. It's saying the completeness, the totality of God's judgment is marked out by the fact there are 7 seals. That means it measures, it covers everything. It's the end of the story, the whole of the thing. And so you'll see that John goes a bit nuts with his numbers and his parts of these numbers. So the names of God, like the Lord Almighty, or Alpha and Omega, they appear in patterns of 4 and 7 throughout the book. The name Christ appears 7 times, Jesus and the Spirit, both 14 times each. The Lamb appears 28 times. And as I've said, the key parts of the book are structured around these sevens: 7 churches, 7 lampstands, 7 bowls. So as you can see, John is keen to point out that Revelation isn't local, its scope is universal, its scope is cosmic, that actually the whole of creation will be affected by the events in Revelation. The whole of creation is subject to God's rule and reign and victory, if that makes sense. So, any questions on that? Nope. Stunned silence. Excellent. Okay. So why use all these blasted symbols? Why can't he just tell us? Well, as I mentioned earlier, they function like parables. So what you'll see is the prophets used parables when prophesying to Israel, indicating that judgment was coming on the anesthetized majority, though a remnant would be shocked out of their spiritual malaise. And parables function in the same way. Now, you'll remember, those of you who are here in week 1, my definition of a parable is a story that entertains you at the front door while the truth sneaks around the back, sneaks through the house, and then smacks you over the back of the head. And that's kind of how these images work. The idea is they were to be shocking. They were to kind of shake people that had fallen asleep, shake people that were drifting away, and bring them back to life in God. And it's interesting how, in the Old Testament in particular, there's a phrase that Ezekiel uses: "He who has an ear, let him hear." And we see that in each of the letters to the 7 churches, but we see that phrase in Isaiah, in Ezekiel, and Jesus uses it as well, time and time again, following on from the parables. So again, this idea of symbolism, that here I'm saying something to you that has a symbolic message. It's the delivery vehicle for a truth you need to hear. But the reality in Isaiah, Ezekiel, with Jesus, and also with Revelation is not everyone will get it. Not everyone will hear and understand what I'm saying, but some of you will. And those of you that do hear it need to pay attention and change your behavior, change your ways. So I thought that was a really interesting little thing, that actually this is a thread that runs through the whole of the Old and New Testament. This idea of actually these warnings, let him who has an ear hear, kind of time and time again. Wake up, listen, pay attention. This stuff matters. Don't just slide back into the way you were. Keep following, keep moving forwards. So, a brief outline of the book of Revelation. So you can see here we have the chapters down the left, and then the kind of the themes that Revelation contains. And this is just a brief overview of it. That you have the prologue where John explains he's a prophet and how he came to have the vision. We then have the 7 churches, the letters to the 7 churches. And unfortunately, they're letters to the imperfect church. They often are pointing out something that's gone wrong. We then have this glorious vision of God on the throne. And then we have the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 visions, the 7 bowls, then the final judgment of Babylon and the beast, then God on the throne and the millennium. We then have the new creation and then the epilogue. Now, the reason I've laid this out is because it is, those of you who can spot these things, a chiastic structure, which means it does this. So it mirrors through the book. And actually it mirrors these themes. So we have the prologue and the epilogue kind of mirror each other. We then have how the first two chapters that talk to the seven churches, the imperfect church. In 21 and 22, we have the church perfected. In 4 and 5, God on the throne with this amazing vision of heaven. In chapter 20, we see God on the throne again. And then we have the battle and judgment, which forms the meat in the middle, if you like, of this wonderful sandwich. That is the book of Revelation. And you can see, actually, this is quite a helpful way of seeing it, because it drives home how this would have been encouraging to the early church. So I've photographed a couple of sections out of one of the books I've been reading, because it makes it really clear. This is the mirroring of the imperfect church in the 7 letters at the start to the church perfected in glory at the end. And it contrasts false apostles, true apostles, false Jews, the tribes of true Israel. Christians dwell where Satan's throne is, Christians dwell where God's throne is. So you can see this pattern within the book of Revelation. So if you are an early church, you're an early Christian being persecuted and forced to worship the emperor, the encouragement that actually God is at work and these promises will one day be fulfilled, and that actually you will become that which you long to be, would have been encouraging. And this fulfillment of promise goes even further, that actually there are promises contained in 2 to 3 that we see fulfilled in 21 and 22. It's a bit sketchy, this one. Sorry, it's not so clear. But it's interesting how he talks in the letters to the churches, they will be clothed in white. And then in 21, we have the bride adorned for her husband. The promise in 2, that they will rule the nations and sit with Christ on his throne. In 22, they will reign forever. So you can see this beautiful symmetry in the book of Revelation between promise and hope and fulfillment that actually would have been really encouraging to those early believers, because they understood the chiastic structure, because the scriptures are full of it. And so they would have seen this pattern and it would have been really encouraging to them. And actually what you see is the point of Revelation then, when you read it like this, is the bit in the middle. These judgments on Babylon aren't the point. The point is they are a necessary stage to achieve the fulfillment of the promises we read in the first bit that we see fulfilled in the second bit. Now, at the risk of being slightly contentious, commentators increasingly are thinking that the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 visions, the 7 bowls, and the final judgment are not chronological. Revelation isn't written as a guide to what will happen chronologically in the history of the world. That actually these judgments and these battles run concurrent. So what they call this is the recapitulist theory, that actually what he's doing is he's telling the same thing in different ways to keep making the same point. They build on each other. So an example again from the Old Testament would be the vision that Joseph, the dream Joseph had, the king Pharaoh has. You have the storks and the cows, both making the same point, that actually sometimes visions build on each other. And the idea that people tend to take these passages of Revelation and say, well, it says, and after this, this happened, to mean chronology, when actually it can be read as, and after this, my next vision was this. So actually what John is saying is, these are all different images and pictures making the same point, that God is supreme, God is sovereign, and God has the final victory, and Babylon and the beast will face judgment. But there will be trials, there will be tough times, and it will be a struggle. And I think when you read it that way, that actually that he's trying to encourage the believers to understand that actually a lot of the stuff they're experiencing, you know, is hideous, but it doesn't mean God is losing. And so I think that there's something about the idea of reading it in that way, that these visions are all making the same or similar points, is really helpful. And you'll find that when you do read it, that those different passages, it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. If you were to try and interpret them literally and say, there will be this period of time when this happens, it will be followed by this happening and this happening. Well, some of them look remarkably similar, and also, pardon me, they're so chock full of fantastical imagery. The idea that we are actually meant to expect triple-headed or dragons with 4 heads or whatever it is slightly crazy. And the danger is in mining these stories for what literally is going to happen in the future, we miss the point of them and we miss their encouragement. And actually, in some ways, it can look like, if you just read those, that God's victory is in doubt at different points. It looks like Satan's winning. Whereas Revelation most clearly is not intended to give anyone that impression. Revelation is entirely about the fact that Satan's days are numbered. So, in summary, from the death and resurrection of Jesus to his return will be an incredibly challenging time for his followers, but they should persevere with hope and confidence in the face of these challenges. Revelation reminds us that God is the supreme king with power and authority over all creation, both physical and spiritual, and he will prevail, Jesus will return, and his church will be lifted up to spend eternity with him in fulfillment of all his promises. That is what John wants you to take home from reading Revelation. And that's what I believe the early believers would have read. So I don't think it is intended to be a roadmap to the end times, but it is meant to be an encouragement to those undergoing persecution. Does that make sense? Any comments or questions on that? Eileen, you're muted. You're going to have to unmute yourself.
So the thing is, the Gentile believers would have found that much more difficult than the
Correct.
Jewish believers.
Yeah. And that's where I think the way the letters would have been read aloud in community. So we tend to think of the letters the way we read them, which would be the believers would take them away to their home and try and decipher the text like we do when we're reading the Bible. But the reality is the messenger would have rocked up in church. They'd have had a meeting. They'd have got everybody together. He'd have got up. He'd have read the letter, and everyone would have discussed it as it was being read. So the Jewish believers who were there and understood some of the imagery and some of the things he was saying would have been able to explain it to their Gentile brothers and sisters. So it was read in community, which is something I think we miss sometimes when we try and reduce the Bible for private study. We miss that ability of believers to encourage one another and explain to one another. Eileen, you had your hand up.
I did have my hand up. Thank you. That has been enormously helpful. Filled in lots of gaps for me from other lectures, so that was great. Sometime I'd like to hear how you read and see the timing of the millennium, and will it be believers left on earth? It seems to be a time capsule of its own, and I'd dearly like to understand a bit more about it. Who will be there before or after the rapture?
So the first thing, it depends which commentary you read. The commentary I've been using for this lecture and the related commentaries would argue, once again, because it's 1,000, it's a number of perfection. So it's not a literal number of years.
Okay.
So it's a picture of something about the church. And they would also argue that actually we live in the way that Revelation kind of works chronologically is it's the age of the church. So in some ways that period could be a representation of what the church has been experiencing and is experiencing and will experience until Christ returns. So it's a tricky one. It is a tricky one, and it does depend which commentator you use. I think I dare say the safest way to read it is possibly symbolically, though, rather than looking for 1,000-year period and fretting about how that's going to work. Because the minute you do that, Revelation starts to break down. It's really hard, to work out which bits. If you start to say some bits of it are quite literal, then it gets very tricky very quickly. So to read it more symbolically, I think, potentially is more encouraging and potentially keeps us from straying into areas where it would be pure speculation in some ways.
Yeah, okay. Otherwise, it gets a bit...
millennialist, Eileen, if you must know.
Oh, okay, I'll write that down.
So In other words, I
Thank
don't
you.
think there is a millennium. I think it's symbolic and that it's
No.
telling us something else.
Thank you very much for that.
Pleasure. Any other
Right.
comments or questions?
So, Dave, it's quite different from the end of the last battle, right? So,
Yeah.
but a lot of people have something like the last battle in their head, which I think they reimpose on Revelation.
Yeah, because Lewis gets it wrong. Because C.S. Lewis actually has the whole thing being destroyed. Creation is wound up, and a new creation is kind of brought in instead of it, which certainly writers like Tom Wright take a great deal of issue with. Did I just criticize C.S. Lewis? Sorry. Heresy!
No.
So yeah, I
Yes.
think you're right. I think the last battle is tricky. I think it contains a lot of really helpful imagery, particularly around the Antichrist and how people will follow something that looks like it's the real deal but isn't, and how easily we're led astray. But particularly the imagery at the end, I think some of it is possibly unhelpful in light of the way God renews things and redeems things rather than destroying them and replacing them. Would be one point I'd make. Although his description of eternity, that the school term was over and the summer holidays had begun and they would go on forever, I do love. I think it's a beautiful image.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
just to
it's
say as well, Terry
66.
Pratchett gets it wrong as well. So Good Omens is not a reliable source for understanding the end times either.
But that is a good book.
That is an excellent book, and the TV show is very good as well.
TV series is great. So 666 then, presumably, if 7 is a perfect number, 6 is presumably a not quite perfect number.
Yeah. And so there's a whole load of fun stuff that John does with 6. Because funnily enough, 6 is the numerical value for Emperor Nero. So Nero's name is a 6. And there are various other 6s that appear in the book of Revelation, but they are all bad. 6 is bad, as you say. It's not 7. It doesn't get to 7. So yeah, 666 is the number of imperfection, of evil, of destruction, and anything to do with 6s is bad, unless they are multiplied to 12, and then they become good.
Oh.
At the risk of sounding very Monty Python and the Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch, but yeah, 6 is bad unless you go on to 12 or 7 or 24 or 48 or yeah, and so on. Any other comments or questions?
I just, I don't know whether anyone's read Haim Potock's books, which are written, he's a Jew, well, he did now, but he writes about Orthodox Jews in America.
Okay.
And I've just remembered now, there's an awful lot in there about numbers, when they're studying the Torah, the idea of numbers. I hadn't thought about that before, but when you said 666, they've got all that comes into these books.
Okay.
I found reading those helped me to understand the New Testament.
Yeah.
Because you get the idea of how Jews think.
Yeah.
They do.
Yeah.
To me.
Yeah, there's
I
definitely
recommend the books.
Yeah. So anything by rabbinic sources or Messianic Jews is often really helpful in understanding the context, and they often find things that we would easily miss. That's why I also mentioned, where's it gone? Kenneth Bailey's book. Where's that gone? My wife's giving it away to someone as a present. Which is what she does with all my books. I was waving it last week. Where's it gone? Anyway, Kenneth Bailey's book is very good at putting Jesus in his proper context, because Kenneth Bailey was at the university in Jerusalem, and so is an expert on Middle Eastern times. So he, as you say, anything that helps you understand the Jewish mindset and worldview is of great help. As is a beautiful little book called The Gift of the Jews, whose author's name escapes me again. I did have that here. But that's a great book as well, The Gift of the Jews. And on the subject of resources, I meant to say, share screen. In terms of, hang on, let me try that again. managed to crash everything. Excellent. Here we go. Share that. Right. You see that?
Yeah.
So these books, each of those commentaries on Revelation are very, very good. I have to say the middle one is probably the best commentary I've ever read. It is absolutely outstanding. And this is...
Dave,
yeah.
Was it a revelation?
Oh. Oh.
It was an absolute revelation, my friend, an absolute revelation. But this is his shorter commentary, because he wrote a 10,000 word commentary, which is this one's big brother. But this is easy to read, and it is absolutely exceptional. It's very, very good. But as I say, Ian Paul on Revelation or Tom Wright, each of those guys would take a similar approach in their emphasis of the Old Testament, in correctly understanding the book of Revelation, and would tend towards a more symbolic reading of the Old of Revelation than some others that you might come across. Resources not to turn to for understanding Revelation would be the Left Behind series. It's great. It could be a great read. You're welcome to enjoy it, but please remember it is fiction, and it's not particularly scholarly in its approach to the end times. So just a word of warning about that. And also tread carefully when Googling this stuff. There is a lot of crazy out there, and Revelation, if Revelation is an intensification of Old Testament prophecy, then videos about Revelation on Google are an intensification of the normal level of crazy that you find on the internet. So there's a lot of crazy out there. So do be wise in what you watch and read about Revelation on the internet. Any other comments?
So Dave, yeah, here's a question. Right, so for the people at the time, it was really about Rome, right?
Yeah.
But they were using the language of Babylon.
Yeah.
To talk about Rome. And so to some extent, we can compare that to our situation. And for us, it's not Rome, right?
Yeah.
But
if you say America, I'm going to drive to your house right now and stab you.
I was going to say, to what extent can we do that? To what extent do we read it in today's context? And to what extent do we say, well, it was about Rome, so that's that? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think the example I gave from Revelation 17, that actually a lot of the things that he's accusing Rome of, in the same as when we read the Old Testament, the things that he accuses, the prophets accuse Israel of, they accuse Tyre, Sidon, they accuse Moab, they accuse Edom, all these kingdoms, the things that they draw out and that they critique are critiques that are relevant to the world around us. And in particular, it's about our collusion with them. So it's not so much that they're bad, which they are, but that we collude with them, that we are seduced, that we commit adultery, that we lose our faithfulness to God, who should be our first love and who should have all our allegiance. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to read Revelation where it critiques Babylon, or it critiques through Babylon Rome, to see how we have colluded with those powers as well. And also how we see the corruption in the world around us. So again, to be very wary of all human economic and political endeavors as being fallen, for a want of a better word. They will contain elements that are good, but to be wary of them, and do not ever think they will do things for you that only God can do. We mustn't make idols out of those systems or those, or people in some ways. So I get very nervous when Christians say, oh, well, we should vote for this person because he's a Christian. And then they say, oh, well, he's the only choice because he's the Christian out of the two. You still need to recognize that everybody is fallen. We've all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So look at what he's saying, look at his life, look at what he's doing. And I think Revelation is a helpful critique because, again, Revelation's concerns are very similar to the concerns of the prophets, and often it's around economics and wealth and prosperity as a way we get seduced into worshipping the wrong things, as well as sex, power, all of it leads to idolatry. So I think it's a valid reading to read Rome and then reflect on our current situation, see the critique, and apply it to our context, if that makes sense.
Wow. That's been enormously helpful, Dave. Thank you.
I'm glad. Any final comments or questions? No?
It's interesting you say about sometimes it depends which commentary you look at.
Yeah.
I've studied terms of Bible Study Fellowship and Trinity Open Learning, and each group has a different slant or interpretation on it.
Yeah.
But I found a great reality in what you've shared tonight, so I'm very grateful.
And that would be the thing for me, was that when you read something and you hear an explanation, does it kind of resonate with you? Does it kind of, you read it, you think, actually, so for me, the idea that Revelation is so seeped in the Old Testament, and actually the Old Testament's the proper place to go to find the keys to unlock it, makes a lot of sense. And it does, and I think it makes it more relevant. So yeah, and I think any idea that anything that takes Revelation and constantly pushes all the stuff it contains into the end times and says we're not there yet, I think we lose out on the encouragement and the challenge and the critique of it in our current day.